Hi, and welcome to the Here Now Human podcast. I'm your host, Manuela Welton, and I'm so grateful that you're here with me today. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Manuela, and this is my origin story. I was born in Colombia, Bogota, to a family of artists. My mother was a ballerina, had a ballet school, and my father was a journalist, a writer, a politician in his form, a educator, political science professor, a man that wore many hats. My brother, a musician, my sister, a photographer and children's book illustrator and writer, as well as author herself. Growing up in this family of art was extreme privilege and just a beautiful way of living. I think that partly I was able to dab into all the art forms, both dance in my mom's school and pretend to write with my father late at night. We would sit with our computers and he would write articles for the newspapers as I was writing books and children's books, which we still have today. It's a great dream to publish some of those books that I wrote with him at one point. I would play in my brother's drum kit and I would run around outside exploring the natural world in our small yard outside of our apartment building in Colombia. It was a city, so I'd never been camping or really a lot of nature for that matter. And back then in the 90s, early 2000s, Colombia was going through a huge civil war unrest, and it wasn't very safe to live there. But, with all things said, my parents kept us very safe and really protected. Um, I definitely saw the doing of that later on in my life, like what that did to my body and I moving at some point to Santa Fe, New Mexico, feeling unsafe walking those streets because I could still feel in my body the level of unsafety that growing up in Colombia was for me in some way, particularly the stories that you would hear from kidnappings and deaths and so forth. My mom shared her ballet school between children that were in the government and also children that were on the streets, and she would provide ballet shoes to those who children growing up in the streets and give them an opportunity to dance, not only with a different societal class, but also in a art that was not very accessible to those, with little to no resource. So she built a bridge between those who could afford it and those who couldn't. And my dad would take me everywhere. We would go to classes together and he would take me to the newspaper. And I was really he was one of my first mentors in life. I was able to learn so much through him and everything he saw and how he wrote and really his activism because he believed in a country that was equal and that there could be equality for all. So he spent most of his life denouncing the government from corruption at a time where nobody felt safe doing so, which put our family in a kind of interesting situation. But before that, we left to Portugal and lived there for 2 years because he also was a consulate for the embassy in Colombia. And that started at a young age, I started realizing what, like, our shared humanity is like, because that was my first experience outside of Colombia, where I saw that even though we didn't speak the same language, we definitely spoke the same cultural background. And I started understanding and seeing just so much of Colombia in Portugal and exploring and getting curious. Art, more creativity. It was definitely some of the happiest years my family had together. And we came back to Colombia, and my father really took a risk in, as I said, denouncing the government of corruption, which denounced our family. Like he was, exiled pretty quickly, and we had to flee very, very quickly. Colombia. Both my dad and I, my mom and brother, stayed back for about 6 months before they came and joined us, or 3 months. And we arrived to the US, to Miami, where my dad and I didn't really fully speak English, but, thankfully, a lot of people spoke Spanish, but it was really rough. I experienced my first level of racism and, it was very difficult for my dad and I to be there. So we left to Maine, Kennebunkport, Maine, because my mom had a cousin there. But that, as you can imagine, wasn't that much easier. My dad was still fleeing, and we had little to no resource as well. If racism in Miami was what it was, you can imagine what racism in Kennebunkport, Maine was. And that's really when I started actually feeling a lot of, just my own need to belong and then not belonging in a country that wasn't my own. I was very excited to be in the United States, but it was very difficult for me to really have, like, a grasp on the culture, and really didn't understand why my dad and I were seen very, like, as different. And my skin is a bit darker, so is my dad's, and so I experienced a lot of, racism, which really opened my eyes to the pain and, like, that can cause. My mom and brother came and joined us, and again, we didn't really have much to live on in the US. I remember at times, like, all we had was enough money to eat at McDonald's for a couple days. Um, my mom being this, like, very well-known ballet teacher in Colombia, and my father being a well-known author in Colombia, had nothing, and so my mom bagged shopping bags in the supermarket, and it was incredibly painful to see that, just because she was coming from, like, having her life be what it was to, like, seeing her lose everything, but both parents lose everything at 50 and have to start over. So that gave me another level of compassion, like, having nothing and seeing that, like, everything that we had could go in an instant. And then we lived in a small cottage in Kennebunkport where there was no heating in the middle of winter. My brother and I shared a room. You can imagine the cold, and my dad was still fleeing from danger in Colombia. Um, my parents did a really good job at hiding everything, so to me, everything was perfect, but of course, I could feel things were different, and I could feel it in my heart. Like, I later on discovered that I actually one of my gifts is to feel. And growing up, even though I felt like everything was, like, even though it was shown to me that everything was okay, I knew inside of me that things weren't. And that's when I started developing kind of super like, I will share the stories of how I started developing a bit of supernatural abilities, which is now what I work with people. Um, and being in Maine wasn't easy. Again, for me, school was very difficult. I got bullied a lot. Being in the situation that I was with my family, it wasn't easy, but it gave me I don't talk about it too much, and it's actually a part of my life that I have blurred, but not because I wanted to, but because it was hard for me growing up in that experience. And then later on, we went to New Mexico where things got a little bit easier, but at that time, my parents put me in a like, for my parents, education was one of the most important things. Even if they had nothing, they would spend their last dime on education. They thought that education would, be so important. And so they put me in a private school even though we had nothing, and I don't even know how we afforded it. But to me, that was very difficult because it was me trying to be somewhere where I didn't belong, and where, like, again, like, we had nothing and I had to be in a school where everybody had everything. So ultimately, I'm sharing all of these experiences because all of these experiences built in me a level of empathy for people that had nothing, and I really always wanted to just help and support those around me that had nothing because I had been through something similar, even though I had my family and the love of my family, and um, the creativity and the level of nurture and courage that my family had. That's literally what I grew up on, was the love of my family. My brother went to school and he was far away, and you know it was then that at age, 12, 13, 14 were a difficult age for me also growing up in New Mexico because it was such a battle of being somebody I wasn't again and trying to fit into a system that I didn't belong to. My poor parents. I love them. Thank you for holding up. I was a rebellious teenager, but not so much. It was me trying to fit into a system that I didn't belong to. And my mom at 15, she was teaching at NDI, which was a school in New Mexico. And my mom, at 15, she had, 3 months before this happened, she had these premonitions that she was smelling, she was gonna die, and she was smelling blood, and she could feel it, she was dying, nobody really believed her. And then I she had, I'll spare the details, but she passed, and at 15, that was an initiation for me to become a woman in some way, which is wild because you think of 15, you think of, like, the importance of your mom and helping you become that woman, but it was almost like a you gotta grow up. And so I went to Mexico where I found different ways of healing and different modalities, and I came across this woman that had shared with me that, I had certain gifts and I needed to explore them, and I had gone to this supermarket and drawn a heart on the fridge, and I had called my dad and I was like, "I really feel mom today." And my dad said, "Really? Because I found this heart in the fridge." And I was like, "No way, I just drew a heart in the fridge." And my dad was like, "I thought you had drawn this heart in the fridge when before you left." And there was no way I had. And it was just like the end. I felt like it was my mom connecting us and bridging us together. Um, and so it was a huge eye-opening experience for me to see that the supernatural that she was there, that she was present. I could hear her, I could feel her, I could see her. I was really mad that she had left. And I remember just before she had died, in some way that how perfect my life was. And I remember saying like how perfect my life is before she died, like a moment before she died. And then suddenly everything shifts and everything changes. And I feel like I lost my dad and mom at the same time because my dad was never the same. Um and yeah, that's when my, and that this is the story that I don't tell people very often. I tell the story of how I became an intuitive and a healer and all these things, but I think this is the story of my own humanity, of experiencing life and heartbreak and pain and grief. And we'll do another episode on my intuition and my gifts and or your gifts and my work, but I think this is the part of me that I don't fully share very often. It's the part of me that experienced, pain at such a young age, and it made me who I am today. Um, so I'll continue. Then I went to Colombia for 2 years, or no, not 2 years, 6 months. I went back to Colombia after not being in Colombia for about 10 years. Okay, being back in Colombia when I was, 17, 16, 17 for 6 months was exactly what I needed to reconnect back to who I was. I had lost my complete identity, and I didn't feel like I belonged in the US, and I didn't feel like I belonged in Colombia. I felt like I don't even know where I was from. There was so much conditioning, so many layers placed on me. I was a 16, 17-year-old girl completely lost in grief, and, while also just attuning and, already starting my healing journey, and I think that will be another episode at some point. Um, but it was the journey that I needed to just start where I was, and it's amazing to me to remember and recount the story and feel like how I lost. I mean, you don't hear an accent in my voice, and you don't hear an accent in my voice because I got made fun of my accent so much when I was that age. And I remember sitting and telling my dad, I need to perfect my accent because I'm being made fun of. And so I come back home to Colombia where I no longer speak Spanish the way Colombians speak Spanish. So everybody's asking me where I'm from. And in the US, I still have an accent, and so people are asking me where I'm from. So I don't belong anywhere. I don't feel like I belong anywhere, and I'm looking for that home. I'm looking for that belonging. I have just lost my mom, um, and I get taken to, the jungle. Not the jungle per se, but I get taken to experience a plant experience at that very young age, which made me really open my eyes to all the masks that I was starting to wear just to belong and just to, like, have self-acceptance and pleasing. And then my sister was pregnant and I was staying with her, and she couldn't have me at her home anymore because I was a rebellious teenager. So I came back to the States. Thank God I did, because what I didn't know was that I was about to lose my dad. And so those were the last 6 months that I had with him before I lost him. But first, I went to college in, um, Maryland to study political science, and little did I know that I would be soon off on my own at that time. So I was very, very, very close with my dad, like extremely close, just like I was with my mom in a different way. But with my dad, it was like I would often tell people, like, he's my sister, he's my brother, he's my dad, he's my mom, he's my cousin, he's my aunt, he's my uncle, he's my neighbor, he's everything. He was everything in one relationship. And it was Halloween and we were talking, and you know, he was doing a residency for the Loudon Foundation in Marfa, Texas, and he was writing a book, 2 books. He was writing a book for my mom and a sonnets called Sun and Moon. Beautiful book. If you speak Spanish, highly recommend. I was hoping to translate it into English because it was a love story from my dad to my mom. And he went and said goodbye to my brother in New Mexico, and I went to visit him, thinking that I was the one that was going to die. I had tons of premonitions, thinking that I was going to die, and so I was saying my goodbyes. And little did I know that I was dying, but in a different form. And um, he was driving back from the airport from Marfa back to his residency home, and he was in a car accident. But, I have had premonitions that he wasn't technically in a car accident, um, but I'll leave it there. And, he died, and that's where my entire world changed, and I was left pretty much on my own from my family, in the sense that what I was a very close nucleus now was just me left in the pond alone. Obviously, I had a lot of people that cared about me, and my brother and my sister, and a beautiful family that took me in at the time, but my world crushed because, as I shared earlier, in all the hardship that my family, um, experienced, the one thing that was there always was my family and their love. So I just continued going out of my way and running and moving and healing. Um, and this is almost like the first time that I take to, like, share this story the way that I'm sharing it. So it's very special to be sharing this here now. Because, as I said, often go to the story where I become the intuitive healer, but I don't often share the background of where that comes from. Um, yeah. And I think this is why this podcast came to be honest, is the love of my parents and the love they had for sharing their knowledge and their truth and their spirit and their art. Um, yeah, it's so deeply ingrained in who I am and what I'm doing. I can just feel it here. But that's like layer 1 of who I am. I'll split this into 3 versions. That's the version of me growing up. And you can hear the version of me in college, and then you can hear the version of me now. Um, But I'll just give this time some space because it when my dad died, like, everything changed for me, and I was able to see life in a different way. I mean, when you lose someone you love so deeply, which my mom was that too, but at least I had my dad. Um, you just realize that life is just so fragile, and you either start living or you freeze. And I believe I started living, but then I like started also escaping because I was so afraid, and I was so afraid of not being safe because my safety net was gone. And yeah, um, yeah, that's a little bit about who I am for now.